If a TV show is going to be defined by a single moment, more often than not, that moment is going to be its ending. HBO and the team behind House of the Dragon should be keenly aware of that, as Game of Thrones, its successor, is very much defined by its final seasons, and even more so by its ending. It made zero sense in the context of the larger story, and it resulted in many people having a terrible taste in their mouth after the show, throwing away all of the goodwill built up by the four excellent seasons to start out the show and the two sort of okay seasons if you turned your brain off following that. House of the Dragon has a very different problem than Game of Thrones when looking at its ending. Game of Thrones went too fast as compared to its source material. George R. R. Martin did not complete the book series in time, and this resulted in the show surpassing the books chronologically, and this resulted in the showrunners essentially making shit up on their own and really not doing a great job at that, wanting to rush off and do a Star War. House of the Dragon is kind of in the opposite direction in terms of potential problems. So today I'm going to break down what those problems might be, what I think might be the perfect ending for House of the Dragon, and what I think makes a good television ending in general. Two things to say before I start the video proper. One is to Ryan Condal directly. Feel free to steal the fantastic idea I'm about to pitch you. And hey, if you're casting YouTubers in House of the Dragon, that could be a good way to repay any goodwill that could be maybe earned here a little bit. The second is to you, the viewer, directly. By the time this video airs, the Season 2 finale of House of the Dragon will have come out, and I'm curious as to your opinion on that ending, as this video is about endings in general. I'm sure there'll be a wide range of opinions on it, and I'm excited to hear yours specifically. So feel free to share that in the comment section below. I should start by saying that any spoilers for the future of House of the Dragon will be very clearly marked. I will not get to them until later in this video when I'm pitching my actual idea for an ending. That aside, what do I think is the actual issue facing House of the Dragon here? I said it's the opposite of Game of Thrones, and I'm sticking to my guns there. They have too much book to work with. Fire and Blood is a history text, and in it ending, it doesn't so much come to a conclusion as it just kind of leaves off as volume 1 of a 2-volume set of history. This means that the end of the book should not be the end of the show, as I believe it's a few years after the show should end, and overall I don't see that the showrunners are going to be willing to spend more time on these events after the actual war itself. The problem then becomes, when is the actual end of the war? When does this story come to a natural and satisfying conclusion? There are, I'd estimate, probably 5 or 6 different points at which one can make a case for the war coming to an end, but I think there is one in particular that, in addition to being a concrete ending to the story and essentially covering all of the iconic events from the book, I think it would also be great in terms of bringing an ending full circle for the series. Before getting there, I'd like to discuss what makes an ending good in my eyes. I feel like in order for an ending to be just satisfactory for the show as a whole, it has to reflect the journey that led up to it. I think that a show is only as good as what it has to say, and I think that the ending often serves as a way to reinforce whatever thesis it has. I also always like it when an ending kind of parallels beginnings of a story. Specifically, one iconic ending I often think of is the ending of The Sopranos, specifically in that it very much mirrors the ending of season 1's finale. That being, in both situations, Tony and his family are in a restaurant eating a meal and having a conversation. And actually, it's even more explicitly remarked on, as AJ specifically references that first conversation in the final scene of The Sopranos, saying that Tony had once told him that it's the good times you have to think about and focus on. Though by the time of season 6, that has completely fallen by the wayside. Tony and the show as a whole has very much been consumed by this nihilism, and remarking on it and drawing this similarity to season 1 allows for the show to kind of just continue and have this ongoing conversation with the viewer about its own tone and the morals and ideals it wants to project. Another important thing for an ending to do is tie up any loose ends. Unless you're planning on having a pretty direct sequel series, it does make sense to have any resolution just wrapped up by that point, and it's important for those resolutions to make sense. I'm less worried about that than I was with Game of Thrones, as Game of Thrones was just working off of the writer's own fan fiction instead of Martin's own writing, but I think that having Fire and Blood will help with that problem. It is just a question of when they're going to end it, because I think some of the points in which the show could be deemed to be over, especially one that I can think of with the death of one very major character, I think it would very much leave a lot of other arcs unfinished. So I think that should be considered going forward. One important element of House of the Dragon to consider is that it's a prequel, and I think that prequels are inherently harder to end. The fact that we know that there is another story coming and it needs to set up kind of for that story, though this is 170 years before Game of Thrones. That said, I think that when a prequel is ended well, it can vastly enhance the original source material. I think that hopefully House of the Dragon will do the same. The best example of that I can see in my own viewing experiences so far comes from my favorite show of all time, Better Call Saul. The series finale, Saul Gone, serves as a finale on two levels. Firstly, to Jimmy McGill's story in and of itself, as it wraps up his arc that has been going on throughout the entirety of Better Call Saul itself, but also it rests largely on what came before it. We see the events after Breaking Bad and what happens to the legacy of Saul Goodman as Jimmy McGill reckons with the worst of what he's done in this world, which was during Breaking Bad. That makes it an essential element of the story to kind of weave into this massive thesis statement it has for Jimmy as a character and what that character deserves. I don't think that House of the Dragon will do exactly this, specifically given the fact that it is such a large gap between these two works. I don't think we're going to end with like Bran before we would, oh, I've just seen the House of the Dragon destroy itself. But I do think that if we are to have a really good ending here, there will be some element of it that mirrors something in Game of Thrones. And you'll see what I mean when I get to it. One final thing I'll say on what makes a good ending is staying true to character. I touched on that briefly when I was talking about Game of Thrones earlier, but for me, the worst elements of the final season of Game of Thrones are how much these beloved characters just abandoned themselves. Jaime Lannister's obviously the worst example, given that he doesn't care much for the people of King's Landing, innocent or otherwise, when his entire moral crux of his story is the fact that he sacrificed his personal honor to save all of them. It just made no sense and was terrible. And I am sure you've heard all this before, but I think it is crucial for characters to remain themselves in this ending. I think that regardless of the events that happen in the war, I think that it's important to see how these characters are affected by it, but for those effects to take kind of realistic impact on these characters. If you do not want the potential future of House of the Dragon spoiled for you, be sure to leave a like and make sure you subscribe to the channel. I talk about A Song of Ice and Fire and House of the Dragon all the time, and I understand that you would want to not spoil the excellent ending that I've come up with that is definitely going to be canon to the show. Ryan Condal, I hope you're taking notes, but without further ado, let's get into the spoiler section, talk about what happens in Fire and Blood, and what event I think is going to be the final act of the Dance of the Dragons as put to screen. Okay, so the event I alluded to earlier as like the potential ending of the series with the death of its main character is obviously, spoilers if you haven't left already, leave now. I guess Joffrey already spoiled this. The death of Rhaenyra Targaryen by Aegon II's hand, or his dragon's mouth, at least. I think that would be a pretty unsatisfying end for the story, given that we don't see how things actually end up for the majority of our characters. That would just seem like a clean victory for Aegon, and that is very much not the case. I think we need to see some of the mopping up of the war. I'd love to see the Battle of the King's Road, see Boris Baratheon finally get what for, and especially the main thing that I think that people are looking forward to in the aftermath of the war is, of course, the Hour of the Wolf and the return of Lord Cregan Stark to the south. The Hour of the Wolf is a tricky event, though. It's one part of a longer regency, and it seems weird to show part of that, but not all of it. But I do think that the ideal point to end House of the Dragon comes from during the Hour of the Wolf. Specifically, I think that there's one moment that could very much parallel the first scene of A Song of Ice and Fire that George R.R. Martin ever thought of. For those of you who don't know, George R.R. Martin has gone on record as saying that the first idea, the main inspirational spark for The Song of Ice and Fire, is the first non-prologue chapter in the series, Bran's first chapter, where we see Ned Stark execute a deserter of the Night's Watch, and then him and the kids find these 6 direwolf pups as the larger mother has been killed by a stag. This is obviously a very iconic scene of the series. It's the second chapter of the books wholesale, first real chapter, not counting the prologue, and the second scene of the show outside of the prologue scene as well, I believe. So overall, I think it's just very important. Oh no, there might be another scene. I'm getting mixed up. In the show, I believe there's the scene beforehand where they're all in the yard, which is a good scene, but is originally added to the show. I think that this is still a very important cornerstone of the text. I think that it being Martin's original idea and incarnation for this series has a lot of weight behind it. And I think that that is something that could be mirrored in a potential ending to House of the Dragon. The Hour of the Wolf is defined by the many trials of those involved in the plots surrounding Aegon II's ascension and later demise. These result in a number of people being found guilty and asking to go to the wall, many of whom are granted this request and just go off never to be seen again. However, there are two characters who agree to be executed. Only one of them we've met so far, that being Larys Strong, who's a character that I like quite a bit. I've done a video on him already. But overall, it is a large majority of people who plead for mercy, but there are two notable executions here. One of whom is a character who we've known since the third episode of this series, and who has cemented himself as a fairly important political player, especially alongside Aegon II. Cregan Stark chooses to execute these two guilty parties in the center of the Right of Keep using ice. There is a Godswood in the Right of Keep as of House of the Dragon's filming, which is not something we know of in the book. So I think it could be quite interesting to have these two executions take place in front of the Godswood, bringing to mind the old gods, the Starks' old ways, and even Daemon's killing of Lord Blackwood in episode 7 of season 2. I think this could be a very good ending for the series, specifically because of one reason. Aegon III, the monarch at the time, who's a child, only 10 years old, 2 years older than Bran in the text, and about Bran's age in the show, insists upon watching. I think that the final scene of House of the Dragon should be Aegon III looking on as Larys, the Clubfoot, and one of his conspirators are executed by Lord Cregan Stark. I think Cregan Stark should encourage the young king that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, and that the old ways have power. I think that this would be a fantastic way to mirror the first scene, the inspiration for the entire series, and bring a wrap on House of the Dragon as a whole, as Larys is a very important character, and I think this scene being one of the last things that Cregan Stark does in the story is just great, as it is kind of the bookend of the Hour of the Wolf, allowing him to return north, and then Aegon III can just continue ruling on and growing up as a monarch on the throne. I think it's overall an ending that brings good circular conclusions both to House of the Dragon and to Game of Thrones as a whole. I think that I need to explain a little bit more of the circular storytelling of House of the Dragon as it pertains to this ending, as I think it is quite important and it could fare quite well. Specifically because I think that the ending scene of the first episode of House of the Dragon should be considered in this ending as well. It's Viserys giving these dire warnings to his new heir. In this instance, it's Cregan Stark, the regent at the time, giving these warnings and advice to the ruler who will come into power later on, though he is currently kind of the king. I think that this will be a great way to kind of echo the beginning of the first episode of House of the Dragon, and not make this just a callback to Game of Thrones, but rather a great ending for this series in its own right. I think that this should be a much better final scene than the stupid, A Song of Ice and Fire, jackass, brothel, honeycomb, whatever the Game of Thrones did. Overall, that's a low bar, but I think that regardless of what Condal arrives at, he will hopefully clear it. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe, let me know what you thought of my ending in the comments down below. I'd really appreciate all of it. It's all free, and it just makes me feel good and helps grow the channel, so any support is much appreciated. I'll have many more videos coming out in the near future, likely fewer on House of the Dragon, more on the books, A Song of Ice and Fire, so stay tuned for all that. It'll be very fun, and I look forward to sharing it with all of you. I will see you in the near future. Goodbye, everyone.